So are you able to see it? Good, all right. So fossils and geology, you can't ever talk about this topic. This isn't, I mean, I'm medically trained, and my thing is, I'm a subspecialty in blood, in hematopathology, also clinical pathology, and anatomic pathology. So I'm more trained in the DNA and protein and blood and all those aspects of the human body. But you can't really talk. Testing, testing. Everybody, though, wants to know about the dinosaurs and the dating methods and why everything's millions of years old. So I had to kind of look at that myself. This is the longest it took me to get my brain around. And I'm not saying I got my brain all the way around it, but this is some of the stuff I've come up with that makes sense to me. So. Testing, testing. All right. There we go. Because, you know, the fundamental problem a lot of people have with this, who I talk to, good friends of mine, who haven't bought into it yet, is that there's no way the Bible can be true, because clearly everything's millions and millions of years old. How in the world can you crazy people believe the Genesis, you know, first of all, the Genesis flood was worldwide, and that all life on this planet only started like 6,000 to 10,000 years ago? How can any rational person believe that? We have all the dating methods and all this layers in the fossil record and all these things that take long, long periods of time. How can you believe any of that? So this is just some thoughts on that. So the geologic column is real, and so is the fossil record. It does look kind of, at first approximation, that things lower down in the fossil record are simpler than things as you go up. Higher and higher levels become seeming more, you got the worms and the mollusks, and then you get higher and you got birds and reptiles and mammals on top, right? So it seems like there's some sort of order to it. So how do you explain that? Also, 650 million years of time. What's interesting about the fossil record is that it looks like it was sudden layers, like a cake of sudden catastrophes. They don't look like they represent the surface of the planet for millions and millions of years. Because if each layer represented a certain epoch of time, it was supposed to be there for a long period of time. And so you would think that if it really was there for a long period of time, it would look like this on the top, kind of a dendritic pattern. But what we actually see in places that are exposed, like the Grand Canyon, it doesn't look like that at all. The layers are flat as a pancake for hundreds of thousands and millions of square miles, sometimes between continents. And so how do you get that to happen? The layers are not eroded. When you go, I've actually been to the Grand Canyon. When you go to the Grand Canyon, it looks like they were laid down like with a razor blade. You could cut a razor blade between them. They're very flat and even, and they go on and on and on and on for miles and miles and miles. How does that happen slowly, is my question. This is what you would expect if it took a long period of time. You'd have flat layers initially from some sort of beginning period, then they would erode, more layers on top, then they would erode, and you'd get kind of this uneven look to your layers. But that's not what we actually see. Here's the Coconino Sandstone in the Grand Canyon, right on top of the Hermit Shale, perfectly flat. And then you got these cracks in the Hermit Shale that are filled with pure Coconino Sandstone. How did you get those cracks there that get filled with pure Coconino Sandstone, no contaminants, if it took a long period of time to produce? And also, within the Coconino Sandstone and elsewhere in particular, but you've got evidence that it was laid down by water. You've got these linear striations that aren't really linear, they're like V-shaped. And people have argued that that can be produced in deserts, but you don't get the that actual V-shaped pattern in deserts by wind-blown sand. It only happens underwater. Like if you go to the beach, this is the picture I took at the beach. But you get those same sort of patterns all throughout the layers of the Coconino sandstone. So the idea that it was a desert dune doesn't make sense. It seems like all of it was laid down by water. There's also footprints throughout the Coconino, and the footprints don't look like they were made on dry sand. They look like they were made on wet sand. Also, the sand itself didn't come from Arizona. It came from the Appalachians, clean across the entire continent. How did it come across the entire continent? Slowly. People have proposed the slowly meandering rivers that were continent-wide that brought the sand from the Appalachians all the way to the Arizona region. But again, it doesn't look like it was done slowly because the layers are so flat and evenly laid down everywhere. And it looks like it was more like sheet layering, like it was done in massive sheets and waves, all the way across the entire continent. And this is backed up by some work by Dr. Arthur Chadwick at Southwestern Adventist University. And he went around and he analyzed, because on the top is each layer, you can see the ripple marks for the currents that the water, where the water laid down the sediment, the sedimentary layers. And you can tell which way the water was flowing for each layer that you look at. And what he saw is that the Coconino and the Navajo sand dunes, they have a consistent direction for the layers when they were laid down. The water was moving in a consistent direction across vast areas, even continent-wide. And then if you move up or down, then you lose, like the lower layer, the very lowest layers, they're random. They don't have a consistent continent-wide distribution. But if you go up to the Triassic, Jurassic, the Coconino, all those layers, they have a consistent pattern, sometimes continent-wide, sometimes between continents, like South America and Africa. And so it seems like the water was flowing in pretty much the same direction, or at least the same general direction, all around the world for a given layer. And then it reversed and goes the other way, and sometimes a different direction, but huge volumes all flowing the same way. Not a little river going by itself. And so I thought that was very interesting. You can contact him as well, but these are pictures from his paper and his research that he's collected millions of data points around the world, but primarily in North America. You also have these trees, pine trees and stuff in the Coconino and Navajo, big trees, of course with no bark or branches. And what do you have big deciduous and pine trees and stuff doing in a desert? All right, and also what happened to the bark and the branches and the roots, the complex roots? It looks like they were washed there and rolled and over and everything. They're missing all that. You also have around the world massive impact craters. Like a third of the Gulf of Mexico, the Yucatan Peninsula, is an impact crater. It's gigantic impact craters. So what I think happened, or what probably, or may have happened, it seems reasonable to me, is that the flood, it says that the fountains of the great deep at the beginning of the flood were broken in a single day, right? So it seems like the world before the flood was fairly flat, maybe rolling hills and stuff. No, you didn't have the Rocky Mountains and, the huge, tall, cragged, broken up surfaces like we do now. It was like more even and rolling hills, and there weren't vast oceans. There were 4 giant rivers and shallow seas around the world. And there was no rain before the flood. The water came up from the ground, and dew watered the ground. And so what happens when all the fountains of the great deep are broken up is that the asteroid impact could have fractured the crust of the globe like an egg and just fractured it. And with such tremendous amount of energy was generated at that point that it started the continental separation and the drift. And initially the continents separated very rapidly, and then as they built mountains, giant mountain ranges and trenches and stuff, that the drift slowed down until we're still drifting now, but it's like a car wreck. The initial car wreck is very rapid, and you get your warped up hood and everything very rapidly until all the energy is used up, and then the cars slow down. And the same thing with crashing continents now, I think, is that they're slowing down. So the current rate of separation or drift isn't the same as it was initially. It was very rapid initially, and it has since slowed down after these massive impacts. And when you get a massive impact like that, you get gigantic tidal waves, especially once the water is already developed. We cracked up the crust. You know, I'll talk about this a little bit later, but underneath the Earth's crust, deep within the rocks, there's these other rocks that hold water. There's 3 times the volume of all the Earth's oceans in the Earth's crust of water. When you compact those rocks and compress them, the water seeps up. And it's more than enough to cover the continent rapidly with a lot of water. And then you have multiple asteroids hitting a flooded Earth, and it creates giant tidal waves, 2,000 feet tall, traveling at the speed of sound. And they're flying around the globe in a circle. You know, an asteroid hits and it creates a circle like a bathtub or a lake, and it goes around and then it goes around the globe and it bounces back. Boom, boom, boom. And so what happens as the wave goes through, it lays down a layer of sediment, and then as the wave passes, it dries off for a little bit so that dinosaurs can walk around, make footprints and things like that in the sediment. And it leaves them, when it bounces back the other way, it fills up another layer. When I was in Canada giving a lecture, they had the dinosaur tracks right there in some of the canyons there, and the layers, some of them are only like centimeters thick, millimeters thick. And each layer has the same dinosaur running around like it's chicken with the head cut off, with its footprints on the next layer, the next layer, the next layer. So the layers are being laid down while the dinosaur is still alive, running around. We'll get into that in a minute. So these giant impact craters, I think, what set off the Noah's flood, the worldwide Noah's flood. It was a very different world beforehand. There were continental plates, but no continents, no great oceans like we see today. And so also the continents, you can see that they fit together like a puzzle, especially Africa and South America. You can see that they once were together. And the llamas and the camels and all that once were the same group of creatures. And so when they got split apart, initially it was very rapid because according to standard thinking, this happened 200 million years ago, right? The problem is that there's too much erosion, and we'll get into that on the edges of the continents for it to be 200 million years old and still fit like a puzzle. So when the crust was broken, they shot up. These giant geysers and sheets of water just shot up through the cracks and flooded the planet rapidly. And Ellen White has a pretty good description of what happened and how fast it was and how terrifying it probably was. And also here's the rock that holds the water in the Earth's crust, some 400 miles deep under our feet. 3 times the volume of the world's oceans exist in the Earth's crust. These kind of a spongy type blue ringwoodite rock. Also, it was right after the flood, so much energy was released, and then also volcanoes, giant volcanoes, all around the planet were taking off because as you start making these rapid continental drifts, you make huge volcanoes go off at the same time, and it creates a very warm world. So after the flood, it was warm for probably 500-600 years, enough time for all the animals to get well established, millions of mammoths in the northern hemisphere around the Arctic Circle, and bison and tigers and woolly rhinoceroses. Even in North America, there were camels and all these animals that were here that aren't here now. Were there right after the flood, and it was very lush, very green all over the globe. There were no ice caps right after the flood. It was too warm. And so all the ice that are present there now that they say is hundreds of thousands of years old, even 1 million years old, that is only a few thousand years old. And I have a whole nother lecture just on ice caps, on why they're young. But all of a sudden, within one season, there was a sudden cold snap. And it trapped the mammoths and all these animals and froze them in the Siberian tundra and the Arctic tundra all around the globe. And millions of them. In fact, some of the biggest exports of Siberia is ivory. They still are finding them all the time when they're thawing out these mammoths that were frozen, sometimes still with their last meal in their mouth. They were frozen suddenly. They had no time to escape. It was a sudden cold snap, and the first ice age happened overnight. In fact, and then it generates so much ice that New York City was covered under about 2 miles of ice. And there was only a tiny little ring around the middle of the earth that wasn't ice. And the Mediterranean basin had no water in it. It was completely dry, and people lived there. There's footprints that are discovered on Crete now and everything that were from that period where there was no water there. And northern Africa, the Sahara Desert wasn't a desert. It was green and lush. Lots of big lakes and savannas and grasslands and giant trees. And it was a very different world. And so when in the Bible it says that the Abraham was told to go to a place of flowing with milk and honey, you're like, that's a desert. What? That's not flowing with milk and honey. Well, it was back then. Right? It was a very different world back then. Because everything else, and it kept it a very moderate temperature. It wasn't really hot because there was ice everywhere else. There was and very little water. There was no giant oceans because it was all in ice. And then when the ice started to melt slowly over time, then eventually the ocean started to fill up, and it got deep enough so that it suddenly broke through the Rock of Gibraltar and filled up the Mediterranean basin in a few months. And that's where you get the Black Sea flood legends from. It filled up the Mediterranean and the Black Sea. And everybody says, well, that's the flood legend of Noah. No, that happened after the flood. That's another flood, a small flood, right? Because the Mediterranean suddenly filled up when it broke through. The oceans broke through and filled up the Mediterranean basin. The speed of erosion, Mount Everest was about twice as tall as it is now. Once it's supposed to be 50 million years old, and then about half of it slid off. It once covered with 6,000 meters of sediment. Now it has 3,000 meters of sediment, and it's all sedimentary layers. In other words, laid down by water. It's just that said that Mount Everest was once flat. Sediment was put on, and 50 million years ago it got lifted up. Well, it doesn't make sense because of erosion rates. The Himalayan erosion rate is about 200 centimeters per thousand years, or 100 centimeter per thousand years of erosion equals about 50,000 vertical meters of erosion in 50 million years. So that's enough erosion to wipe all the sedimentary layers off of Mount Everest several times over in 50 million years. So it doesn't make sense that it's 50 million. It has to be young, much younger than that. And it's much more consistent with the biblical perspective of a much more recent flood that produced all these layers with a rapid continental drift and a rapid mountain building with the layers flowing off within a relatively recent history off the top of Mount Everest. So here's Mount Everest now, and you can see where the layers used to be, how they're tilted up, and they're gone now. They just flowed off. So also the size of the continents. Today's continents average about 0.875 kilometers above sea level. The total land surface area of the Earth is about 150 million square kilometers. The cubic kilometers above sea level is about 130 million cubic kilometers. You guys taking notes of the math now. So an average of several references suggest about 13.6 cubic kilometers of solid material are carried by all rivers of the Earth into the oceans every year. So that's 31,000 million metric tons a year. Okay? So what it all boils down to is the time needed to erode all the continental land into the ocean is about less than 10 million years. Right? The continents, the surfaces of continents cannot be hundreds of millions of years old just because there's too much erosion on it right now. And if you say, well, it just selectively erodes, well, you have to say, well, the ocean basins would be filled up with sediment by now. They would be all the way full by now, and the water would be a much higher level, many times over by now. So I'm not the only one to point this out. I got this from because no one talks about these things anymore. Dottenbat in 1971, they said North America is being denuded at a rate that could level it in 10 million years. Or to put it another way, at the same rate, 10 North Americas could have been eroded since the Middle Cretaceous time 100 million years ago. And these guys are evolutionists. So how do they explain it? Says, even if it's accepted that the contemporary rate of degradation or erosion of land surfaces are several orders, an order is 10 times, so several orders, 10, 100,000, too high to provide an accurate yardstick of erosion in geological past, there's surely been ample time for the very ancient features preserved in the present landscapes to have been eradicated several times over. The survival of these paleoforms, the land surfaces, is in some degree, what do you mean some degree? An embarrassment to all of the commonly accepted models of landscape development. They don't know, i.e. we don't have a clue, right? So all the river deltas around the world are young, between 4,000 and 8,000 years old. You know that based on their sedimentary deposition. The ocean sediments, 30 billion tons of sediment per year. We did the math a little bit. Subduction only removes about 2.5 billion tons by sucking the sediment under other continental plates as one goes underneath the other. So the ocean floor sediment has about 10 to the 17 tons. It only takes about 15 million years to produce that tonnage, right? So where's the rest of the sediment? Oceans are supposed to be 3 billion years old. What happened to the rest of the sediment? No one explains this. It's just not discussed. Selective erosion. At the Grand Canyon, there were once layers on top of the top layer. It's perfectly flat all the way around the Grand Canyon, except you see these tiny little buttes sticking up every now and then. How did you get, over millions of years, all those layers washed away and leave that little butte all by itself? Did it not rain or snow or whatever on that butte? How did it survive? It makes much more sense if you go in your backyard after a flood, at least if you have a muddy backyard like I do, and you see a sheet erosion that goes rapidly through, and you see these little spikes sticking up where the water disappeared before it had time to get everything, right? You don't get it where it's a slow, drizzly rain that goes on for a week. That doesn't happen, right? There's Red Butte. There's a picture of Red Butte. Same thing in Monument Valley. These monuments are horizontally layered. Where did the sediment go between the monuments? Slowly. It makes much more sense with sheet erosion, where it happened rapidly and the monuments just survived and the water disappeared before they all fell over, right? You can't do this sort of erosion slowly over millions of years of time. This is sitting out in the middle of nowhere. Horizontal layers, and this thing just survived millions of years. Also, there's paraconformities where different layers are interdigitated with each other. They're like interfingered with each other. How do you get interfingering with different layers that are supposedly separated by vast periods of time, and then they interdigitate with each other? It only makes sense during a catastrophe where things are whipped up and layers are brought in at the same time and from different regions and sequentially interdigitate at the same time. It's much more consistent with a catastrophic model. Also, they're completely missing layers that are perfectly flat. They're missing flatly. Like here's the wall, limestone right there in the Grand Canyon. The layer right below that should be there is gone, and it's perfectly gone without a trace. There's not even a little bit of it left. You just move it up. How did that happen slowly? So Newell again, 1984. A puzzling characteristic of the erathium boundaries, or the lines between the layers of many of these major biostratigraphic boundaries, is the general lack of physical evidence of subaerial exposure. In other words, it was never the surface of the ground. Traces of deep leaching, scouring, channeling, residual gravels tend to be lacking, even where the underlying rocks are cherty or soft limestone, easily eroded if they represent the surface of the ground. These boundaries are paraconformities that are usually identified only by paleontological or fossil evidence. In other words, there's no physical evidence for them to represent the surface of the ground. They're only saying, well, that must be that age because it contains this fossil, not because there's any evidence that was ever the surface of the ground. And sometimes the layers are angled. They're angled this way, and then another layer comes over and shaves off the top of these layers and makes a flat layer on top of them. So they were pushed up and shaved flatly, and then more layers were added on top. How do you do that slowly? Bioturbation. There's minimal... Oh, the microphone's somewhere. Did I lose it? Must be somewhere. There we go. So, normally in a flood, especially on the Gulf Coast where I grew up, you get hurricanes come in and they layer a bunch of mud layers down, and you can see the layers. But 2 years later, all the layers are gone. How? Because little animals burrow down and mix it up. They churn it all up. That doesn't happen in the fossil record or the geologic column. There were no churning up animals. That only makes sense if you get the layers very quickly and deep before they have the time to churn it up. Clastic dikes. What happens is that you got these layers on top of other layers where the bottom layers squirted up through the top layers and made these pyramids and dikes. They're called dikes. And you got those all over the place, Triassic, Jurassic, everywhere. My question is, if you have a layer that's there for millions of years and it turns to solid rock and then you put another layer on top, how do you get the rock to squirt? It only makes sense if the layers are still soft and muddy. You got a bunch of muddy layers, and the high pressure for deep layers, and the bottom layers are muddy, and then any sort of defect in the layer above, and it will go like toothpaste and squirt up above. And then when the layers get eroded away, you see these different layers are made of different sediments, and they resist erosion differently, and that's why you can see them now. But it doesn't make sense over vast periods of time. Also, the continental drift, 200 million years since Pangea. That doesn't make sense either because of coastal erosion. We know that they fit together, but was it 200 million years ago? That's the question. Louisiana coastline is being lost at 25 square miles per year. In the past 50 years, Washington State has lost over 300 meters of certain of its coastlines. Northern and north central regions of California here are eroding about 30 centimeters per year, with some areas eroding of up to 1.5 meters per year. And it's everywhere. Texas is losing 0.3 to 15 meters of coastline per year. Major Gulf storms can erode 30 to 40 meters in one day. In North Carolina, they had this lighthouse that was built 1,500 meters inland in 1869. It had to be moved another 1,000 meters inland to avoid collapse into the ocean just recently, or about, when was this? A few years ago, in 2000. All over the world, Japan spends billions of dollars to prevent erosion, obviously, because they can't afford much. Yeah. So, question. What if we just had an average of 1 centimeter of erosion, coastal erosion, or deposition per year? What would that look like in 200 million years? 1 centimeter, not very big, just that much per year. Well, 200 million years is a long time. It would be 2,000 kilometers or 1,200 miles of erosion on all sides of a continent. In other words, you'd be left with a little dot in the middle, right? The puzzle, at the very least, the puzzle would not fit like it does today after 200 million years. Also, we talked about the young deltas, all less than about 5,000 years old. And the Gulf of Mexico would be filled in completely by sediment in 10 million years. So potential problems. In the middle of the flood formation and the Morrison Formation, Jurassic, dated about 40 million years, there's termite nests. So giant termite nests. So you're like, that doesn't make sense, Noah's flood. How would termites be building a nest, big giant termite nest, in the middle of a flood? So Ariel Roth at Loma Linda University, he was the only one, because of his biblical perspective, to question that maybe they're not termite nests, right? Because it doesn't make sense. I mean, I agree. It doesn't make sense for termites to be building a nest during a big flood. It's worldwide that lasts more than a year, right? So it looks like termite nests. They look very similar. They got these squiggly lines and everything. But for me, especially this picture, how many go to the beach and then you dribble the wet sand and make these things on the beach? Right? It looks like dribbled wet sand to me, but that's not what it is either. So Ariel Roth went and did a research paper on this. It's published, mainstream journal, and he proved that these termite nests were not termite nests at all, but crystalline formations. They were hypersaturated environments that suddenly form crystalline deposits. And these are giant crystal deposits. And there's the microscopic view of them. And no one would have thought about this except if you came from a biblical perspective to do this research. So he did the research and proved that they were not termite nests. They were crystalline deposits. There's also the problem of last appearance In the fossil record, there's these fish, coelacanths, that are died out 80 million years ago until they were found off the coast of Madagascar alive and well. But they disappear from the fossil record 80 million years ago. But we know that they didn't disappear because they're still alive and well today. They've been found at different places all over the globe now. So how did that happen? They just, well, my friends tell me, well, they didn't live in places where they fossilized anymore. I was like, good one. Right? It's because they're fossilized everywhere before, and now suddenly none. Also the footprints and bones. It turns out that the footprints evolved before the bones in the fossil record. Lower down in the fossil record, you just have footprints, no bones. As you move up, you lose the footprints and you gain the bones. Right? So what happened? The feet evolved before the bodies? It makes much more sense with a flood because in the bottom layers, they're still alive, running around. The layers are coming in and they step up higher and higher layers until they finally get exhausted from repeated tidal waves, knocking them over and them swimming for a while. And finally, they're just like, I give up. And then they get buried, right? No more footprints, just bones, right? That's what this research paper has been also published at Loma Linda by Leonard Brand and a few others. Also, the fossil bone orientation in the fossil record, you would think that if a dinosaur got hit by an asteroid and there's dust everywhere and the atmosphere is toxic or whatever, the dinosaur decided to die, it would just fall over randomly, right? Well, that's not how the bones are in the fossil record. The bones in the fossil record for large bone dinosaurs and lots of things are oriented with respect to flow. In other words, they just didn't fall over randomly, they're oriented. They all decide, hey, George, which way are you falling over? Oh, I'm one of those. Oh, me too. Right? No, they were washed into place. Right? Here's the Dinosaur National Museum near Utah. You can see the orientation. Arthur Chadwick also measures and maps out these bones all over the place around continents, especially North America, and shows how they're oriented with respect to flow everywhere. The Morrison Formation is huge, right? So this didn't happen over millions of years. If they're all oriented with respect to flow, this was a massive flood within a flood. The Jurassic Formation is also famous for millions and millions of dinosaurs. It averages about 300 feet thick. It's 1 million square kilometers from Canada to Texas, Dakota, Idaho, Arizona. It's huge. And it's just distributed by widespread water flow. Fossils are generally oriented. Again, you can look up the research for Arthur Chadwick at Southwestern Adventist. Again, you don't do this research unless you have a biblical perspective. It doesn't even dawn on you, right? There are no river channels. It's just sheet deposition. Jack Horner noted the same thing. He's an evolutionist. Orientation with respect to flow, and then a Montana deposit containing tens of thousands of dinosaurs. Also, there's nothing to eat there. These are gigantic dinosaurs, world's richest dinosaur fossils, including there's fish, frogs, salamanders, lizards, crocodiles, pterosaurs, dinosaur eggs, mammals, shrew-sized mammals. Larger dinosaurs need about 3 to 4 tons of vegetation per day, but the formation is barren of plant fossils. There's nothing to eat. So how did they survive? Stacked forest, Specimen Ridge. So one of my professors at Loma Linda, he said, I asked him, what's your number one evidence to believe that the life on Earth is old, millions of years? And the first thing he mentioned was Specimen Ridge. He said, these forests, dozens of forests, grew one on top of the other, and it takes thousands and hundreds of thousands of years for that to happen. How do you get a forest to grow and then get buried by another forest grows, and another buried and killed off, and another forest grows on top? Because they're all buried like mostly standing up with some kind of roots there and things like that. So I went and looked it up, and the problem is that these forests, they're sheared off, the trees are sheared off on each layer. They have no branches or bark, it's all washed away. The soil is laminated with respect to grittiness, from coarse to fine. You don't get that in a normal forest. You only get that in water deposition. So what happened, also there was chemical signatures for each of these beds. There's only 3 chemical signatures for the dozens and dozens of forests. 3 chemical signatures from volcanic tephra and stuff like that. The chemical signatures change within a few months. For different volcanoes, you can identify them. And they change within a few, to only have 3 signatures, that's not consistent with hundreds of thousands of years. That's more consistent. In fact, now they changed the sign at Yellowstone, at Specimen Ridge. They changed the sign from saying that these were forests that grew on top of each other. Now the sign says, and this only happened since I graduated, now the sign says that these were 3 different mud flows that came from different directions in catastrophic order. Boom, 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 at the same time. They weren't forests growing on. And the reasons why the trees are standing up is because trees, when they sink in water, they don't sink flat. They sink up and down, like that. One side gets waterlogged more than the other, and then they go like up in the water, and then they get sink, and then they get buried standing up. So it's catastrophic. And so I go and ask this professor about this, and he just shifts to something else. Again, no branches, no bark, oriented with respect to flow. They're all tilted with respect to flow. There's no animal droppings. The leaves are misplaced. Pine needles are where deciduous trees are, and deciduous leaves are where pine needles are supposed to be. And anyway, there's just, it's all, and it's fully recognized. Here's the sign again. Sporadic eruptions occurring over about 20,000 years. Makes a big difference than hundreds of thousands of years, and that they're not growing on top of each other. That's the new sign. National Park Service recently issued this statement. Around 1900, F.H. Knowlton proposed a theory that petrified trees on Specimen Ridge were forest petrified in place. This theory remained the dominant theory throughout most of the 20th century. A more recent theory proposes that the trees were uprooted by volcanic debris and flows and transported to lower levels. The 1980 eruption of Mount St. Helens supports this idea. Its mud flows transported trees to lower levels and deposited some trees upright, well, most trees upright, similar to what you see at Specimen Ridge. That's the new sign, right? Again, that's what we thought all along. Pure thick coal beds. There's these coal beds, especially in North America, that are hundreds of feet thick, and they have no contaminants in them. The standard idea is that coals deposit over long periods of time, hundreds of thousands of years. But how do you make pure coal beds and do that? Covers this Powder River Basin coal seam, for example, it covers 10,000 square miles. The coal's 200 feet thick, and it's very pure. It takes 6 feet of vegetation to produce 1 foot of coal. So that's 1,200 feet of vegetation that has no contaminants. How do you get that to happen over vast periods of time in some peat bog somewhere? It makes much more sense that the vegetation was uprooted from somewhere else, brought in by a flood in a gigantic mat, and shoved into place, and then covered rapidly, and made a pure vegetation seam that made pure coal. Also, dinosaur eggs are very interesting around the world. Here's a nest of dinosaur eggs where when the mother was laying the nest, the eggs in the nest, each egg is on a different level in the sediment. In other words, the flood was coming in as she was laying the eggs. And so this wave would come in and she would lay the next egg and it would be higher than the next one. Also, dinosaurs, when they laid their eggs, they were under stress. Normally, the eggs have 1 layer of the shell. These layers have 2 or 3 or more layers. And that only happens when a bird maintains the egg inside its body during stress, and it keeps adding more shell layers to the egg. Instead, it doesn't want to lay it because it's under stress. It's running for its life or whatever. And so it looks like, and this is true all the way around the world, everywhere. All these fossilized dinosaur eggs were laid by dinosaurs that were under stress. How does that make sense over millions and millions of years? You would think somewhere during the millions and millions of years, the dinosaur would have been okay. We already talked about the bioturbation. It's just not there, at least not like what you would expect. Arthur Chadwick, again, has written about this. We've got human footprints in Crete older than chip footprints in Africa, right? The chip footprints in Africa, like, are supposed to be like the transitional species to modern humans 2 million years ago. But now they recently discovered the footprints in Crete just a few years ago that are dated older, an older sedimentary rock than the ones in Africa. Again, that's when the flood came into the Mediterranean basin and moved everybody out. Dating methods. Preserved preserved soft tissue. In a sizable fraction of large dinosaur bones that are actually investigated nowadays, there's preserved soft tissue original to the dinosaur. It's not all turned to stone. There's actual original dinosaur tissue, even blood vessels and blood cells. And Mary Schweitzer discovered this originally in 2005 and has written several papers about that since, even one in 2020, fragments of DNA as well. And so what's interesting about the soft tissue is that proteins and tissues degrade rapidly over time. Forensic science and all this, that you just don't, and antigens disappear. Even my slides as a pathologist, if I keep my slides stored for more than 10 years in a Reading environment where it gets over 100 degrees in the summer and I don't keep it cool, in 10 years I can't use that slide. I can't use those slides anymore to stain them because they won't take up the antigen. The antigen expression will no longer be there to take up the antibodies that bind to them. And it degrades rapidly, and we know the timing for this based on temperature. Different temperatures have different degradation for proteins. The long and short of it is basically these proteins shouldn't be there longer than 100,000 years. They should be completely gone if they're more older than that. So how in the world did these proteins are still antigenic in these dinosaur proteins. So a lot of them are antigenic, and we know their sequences and the immune response that they elicit. They're injected into rabbits, that's how we know that. And here's the blood vessels with blood cells in them. Here's osteocytes inside the dinosaur bones. And there's the DNA isolated binding inside the dinosaur cells. So in order to elicit an antibody binding response, DNA has to be intact between 35 and 45 base pairs to do that. So even under best preservation, like -5 degrees C, here's a paper says, our model predicts that no intact bonds will remain in the DNA strand after 6.8 million years. That's -5 degrees Celsius, right? Or 23, that's freezing. This displays an extreme improbability of being able to amplify 174 base pair DNA fragment in 80 to 85 million year old bone like Schweitzer has claimed to do multiple times. So he's casting doubt on this, saying that's impossible. It should be gone, right? Kinetic calculations also predict small fragments of DNA, 100 to 500 base pairs, will survive no more than 10,000 years at temperate regions, like average, let's say it's 50 degrees. No more than 10,000 years, 100,000 years at colder latitudes. So the question is, why is the tissue there, and why is it antigenic? And why are the blood vessels there? Why are the red blood cells there, and the osteocytes and all those other things? So at the very least, those dinosaurs' tissues can't be more than 1 million years old. And there's no way to preserve them. People talked about formaldehyde or cross-linking with iron preservation. None of that really significantly extends the life of the proteins to any significant. I mean, you can do that in human terms, like for a few years, but they still break down rapidly. Even my tissue blocks in pathology break down if I don't keep them. Even when I keep them frozen, they still break down after 20 years. So it's hard to imagine how these tissues. It's even miraculous that they maintained a few thousand years like they have. So here's a picture or a video clip on this interview with Schweitzer.
He shipped the bone fragments that fell out to Mary Schweitzer.
So the first piece I pulled out, I picked it up and I looked at it and I said, it's a girl and it's pregnant.
That's the first time, as I understand it, that anyone had ever been able to identify gender in any dinosaur.
Yes.
Mary recognized a specific type of bone called medullary bone, which female birds produce when they're about to lay eggs. No one had ever found it before in a dinosaur.
She calls up and says, we have medullary bone.
Oh, now this had to be thrilling.
Yes, very exciting. And that wasn't all.
What happened next happened by mistake. Mary put some fragments of the bone in acid to dissolve away the outermost layer of mineral. But the acid worked too fast and all the mineral dissolved away. Being a fossil, there should have been nothing left. But there was. And it was elastic, like living tissue.
This is the piece
No. She showed us video she took under the microscope.
That's really what happened?
Yes.
That's the dinosaur bone?
Without mineral now. That's what was left.
It looked like the soft tissue she would have expected to find if it had been modern bone. This was impossible. This bone was 68 million years old.
So you see this and you think, what? You
I didn't want to tell anybody.
that you'd be ridiculed,
Yes.
right?
And so I said to my technician, okay, do it again. I don't believe it.
And yet, in sample after sample, they were there. Things that looked suspiciously like flexible, transparent blood vessels. She finally mustered the courage to tell Jack.
She said she dissolved the bone away and there were blood vessels. And, I was like shocked.
How could that be?
How could that be? That's right.
The things Mary was finding inside dinosaur bones,
Look at that.
blood vessels, and even what seemed to be intact cells, pose a radical challenge to the existing rules of science, that organic material can't possibly survive even 1 million years, let alone 68 million. Mary, Jack, and their team published their B-Rex findings in a series of papers in the journal Science and were promptly attacked. Critics said their samples might have been contaminated, or that the supposed blood vessels were actually something called biofilm, a type of slime. But as Mary showed us, she's been able to replicate her findings. These are pieces of an even older dinosaur, a well-preserved 80-million-year-old duckbill. When she dissolved it away in acid,
Let's put this under the scope here.
well, look, is that a blood
This
vessel?
is a blood vessel. You see the branches right there? And look at all of them. And it's so consistent over and over and over again. We do this bone and it comes out and I get excited every time. I can't help it. 80 million years old.
Mary published her new results last spring, and while some of her critics have been swayed, the controversy still rages, and the stakes are high. If blood vessels can survive 80 million years, what about DNA?
Inside those channels where the blood vessels would have run were these little round red structures that were all kind of lined up like a train, and they were bright red and translucent. Nobody else had seen anything like that before.
The very idea of blood cells in a 70 million year old bone was more than unconventional. It was radical. Derek Briggs is curator of invertebrate paleontology at the Peabody Museum at Yale University.
What was your initial reaction to that?
Oh, I think the same reaction as everybody's, that this was totally improbable. She perhaps misinterpreted the evidence or was exaggerating the potential for what she was seeing.
Has anybody else that you know of found similar things inside a bone?
No.
Why do you think it didn't occur to anybody?
So it just goes on like that. This is actually an older video. It's more. They actually did find DNA since then. So radiocarbon dating. Turns out the dinosaur bones, also the soft tissues, have radiocarbon in them, the same levels as mammoths that lived, we know, until Egyptian periods on different islands and northern regions until modern history. And they have the same level of carbon-14 in them. The thing about carbon-14, it has a half-life of 5,600 years, or around there, and or 57. And so carbon-14 is undetectable after about 80,000 years. So the fact that it has measurable levels of carbon-14 dating these things at between 20,000 and 40,000 years old, I was like, how do you contaminate? And the explanation is contamination. Carbon-14 was contaminated in these dinosaur bones, but all of them at the same rate? I mean, where's the radioactive elements? Is there like uranium everywhere at the same rate, contaminating these dinosaur bones with carbon-14? It just doesn't make any sense. So, also we talked about Stockel and Thayer saying everything showed up at the same time, between 3,000 and 6,000 years ago. We also talked about the detrimental mutation rates. And I'll close with this. Things seem to were bigger and better in the past. This is just kind of cool stuff. This is a 2-ton armadillo. You have to like that in your garden, right? Hey, buddy, back off. This is a 485-pound beaver. Right? Like, wow. So this is me in Brazil holding a 5-pound sloth. And this is the giant sloth that weighed 5 tons in the fossil record. So, and dragonflies in the fossil record. This is a dragonfly with a 30-inch wingspan, or 2.5 feet, enough to carry off small children. This is Gigantopithecus, 10 feet tall. Giant ape. Megalodon, the great white shark. The tooth of the great white shark is in the guy's right hand, the little small white one. The megalodon tooth is in the other hand, filling up his whole palm. You could swallow a whole family for a snack. He was 50 feet long, some say over 90 feet long. The great white shark is about 20 feet long. So yeah, there's a scuba diver in comparison between the great white and the megalodon. Also, the whole idea of Neanderthal, originally on the left, there was that kind of ape-like, you know, and not very big brain. Well, it turns out that the actual Neanderthal looked more like Jean-Luc Picard on Star Trek, on the right side. And they had bigger bodies, bigger brains than we have today on average. And they could run farther because they had an occipital bun that balanced out their weight on the back of their skull, because our faces tend to be heavier. Modern human faces tend to be heavier in the front. But the Neanderthals had a balance weight on the back to keep their head from bobbing up and down while they were jogging, and so they could run farther. They had better endurance. They even did experiments on this with athletes. If you put a weight on the back of your head, you can run farther. Go figure. So, and they also were genetically within the range of modern humans, genetically. There's some modern humans that are more genetically divergent than Neanderthals to the average modern human. So you could rightly wake up in the morning and call your neighbor a Neanderthal. So, the semicircular canals for Australopithecus, supposed to be the transition between humans and apes. The problem, and they're supposed to have walked knuckle walkers. Then later on, they did analysis on the inner semicircular canals and the ears, and they didn't walk on all fours or knuckle walkers. They walked upright, like or not these ones. These were true apes that walked on, like tree climbing apes. So they figured that out with the semicircular canals. They weren't human at all. And their knees were a different angle, so they knew that they lived in trees, and based on their hand joints and their knees. So it turns out that they weren't a transitional species after all. So that's it, guys. You made it. The real reasons dinosaurs went there. So any